genetics and the discovery of the environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals. First, I want to apologize to the speaker, Marcia Richmond, for scheduling it on this day. Not only is the weather very bleak, but a good chunk of the university's population is right now at the orchestra hall celebrating the university's commemoration of Martin Luther King's Day. It's so very thoughtless of me to not schedule this important talk at a more propitious time. But you are here, and it's an important topic, and you're going to hear a very distinguished scholar talk about it. Marcia L. Richmond received her PhD in the history of biology from Indiana University. Before coming to Wayne, she worked on the Darwin Correspondence Project at Cambridge University, England. But here she teaches environmental history and the history of medicine, as well as the history of Wayne. She's completing a book on women in genetics, 1900 through 1940, and embarking on a scientific biography of Theo Colborn and the discovery of environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals. She is recognized in her field. She is the immediate past president of the International Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Science of Biology. And she is the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of the History of Biology. She is a very modest person, and so in keeping with that modesty, she only gave me a very thin slice of her bio to read. But I'm going to not lose this opportunity to tell you about some of her awards. She is a foreign collaborator for the National Council for Science and Technological Development in Brazil. She started that collaboration in 2016, and it continues here. She won the Margaret W. Rossiter Award for the Best Article on the History of Women in Science for a piece entitled The Domestication of Hereditary, the Familiar Organization of Geneticists at Cambridge University, 1895 through 1910, published in the Journal of the History of Biology in 2010. She won a National Science Foundation Scholars Award between 2007 to 2010 for $136,000. The National Science Foundation Award of any amount is a great distinction, so for that amount is an indication of the importance of her work. And more recently, she won here, Wayne State University's graduate schools Graduate Research Assistant Award, which is very competitive. Lots of very, very distinguished scholars compete for it, and she was able to win. I need to also tell you how she has supported the work of the Humanities Center. For one thing, for many years, and I'm not sure if it's still going on this year, she has led the working group in science and the humanities. From 2004 on to 2016, with gaps intermittently, she has assembled scholars who are interested in science and who are interested in the humanities to bring about a rapprochement between those two groups. I mean, this university is trying to promote STEM, and I hope that they are involving Marcia in that effort. She was a faculty fellow in the humanities in 2013, 2014, and also in 2010, 2011. She was a resident scholar from 2008, 2009, and she was Marlin Williamson Distinguished Faculty Fellow for the Humanities Center in 2018, 2019. We have just celebrated the work of Shulika Chandra, who was the most recent recipient of this award. And Chandra joined a list of distinguished scholars who have held that award here. So you're in the presence of a very important scholar, and she's going to take the time to explain to you the significance of Theo Colburn, the Great Lakes, and the discovery of environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals. So on this bleak, cold morning, please give a warm welcome to the podium of Professor Marcia Richmond.
Walter always makes me blush when he gives his introduction. That's why I tried to give it just a little bit instead of a long one. But I also want to thank Walter and the Humanities Center because they have supported my scholarship amply over the last few years, and it makes a big difference. So just to recognize their support as well. This talk comes from a book project that I'm currently engaged in, and it is just a little slice of what will be the second chapter in the book, which is, how Theo Colburn came to the discovery of endocrine disrupting chemicals. So for those of you who don't know what that is, I hope that I am able to explain the significance of this discovery as we go through the presentation. She was a remarkable person. She only died in 2014, and she was a wildlife biologist, worked for all of her career with the World Wildlife Fund, and but she was employed in the late 80s on a specific project as a consultant to the group of Canadian biologists to look at the impact of pollution in the Great Lakes on wildlife. And that was the spark of what the project that developed from that. Namely, the discovery that synthetic chemicals were in the environment, and they were what was causing a number of problems that the wildlife were experiencing at the time. So I'm going to examine how she discovered that endocrine disrupting chemicals were afoot, not just in the Great Lakes, but as we're going to see, they transfer as well. But I'm going to embed them in a little mini discussion of pollution in the Great Lakes in general from the 1960s up through the early 1990s. So first let me introduce my character, Theo Colburn, in a shot that's taken at the time that she graduated from college. As I tell my students in my class, just read this photograph. What kind of a young woman is she? Does she look like somebody who's about to grab the world by and go off? She was a confident, very bright young woman who was able to access resources that got her where she needed to go. She came from a middle-class family, but her father had lost a lot of income during the Second World War. He wasn't going to be able to send her to college, but she found a scholarship that gave her a full ride to Rutgers. and she used that scholarship to become a pharmacist. And she married a pharmacist, and his parents had a series of pharmacies. So the two of them established a family in Orange, New Jersey, and had 4 children, and eventually had 3 pharmacies that they were working with. But as I noticed, in the early 60s, they got the itch to change up their lives. I think partly that was because in the early 60s, large pharmaceutical companies began to put a lot of pressure on small mom and pop pharmacies, and they didn't like what was happening to them. So they sold up everything, their pharmacies, their home, and they moved out west. And they bought a ranch in a very small town in, I would say, south central Colorado. It's not, you can see, this is the bottom photo is a shot. It's the kind of a combination between the Mesa country, if you know partly Colorado geography, meeting some of the tall mountains. So interestingly, Theo had been a birder all her life. In fact, almost every photo that I ever find of her, she's got a pair of binoculars around her neck. And she became, through her interest in birding, she got out into nature a lot, and she became very interested in some of the problems that her particular community in Hotchkiss near Paonia was experiencing. As a result, they had 3 coal mines in the area, and it was causing problems, particularly with the water supply there. So she began to focus on water problems. By the mid-70s, she and her husband were experiencing a disconnect, and she divorced him. And her youngest son, youngest child, was graduating from high school, and she decided it was she wanted a change in her life. She enjoyed being a pharmacist, but she decided that if she was going to be able to contribute to environmental causes, she needed an advanced degree. So there was a nearby college in Gunnison, Colorado, and you can see the community here. It's right in the midst of high country. And she went there and got a master's degree in zoology, specializing in water issues. While she was a master's student, she went to the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. Her major professor, got her an appointment there because they had courses on ecology every summer, and she worked with them on a water program, did her field work for her master's thesis, but importantly, it was through that channel that she met the person who was going to become her PhD advisor. Stan Dodson, who had a lab. He was an ecologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and invited her to come and work with him, and she did. But again, she had to get some funding, from the university and other sources to pursue her PhD. She graduated with a PhD in 1985 at the age of 58. I mean, that's the age when many people are thinking about retirement, right? But her career was just beginning, and what a career it was. Immediately, she got her PhD, and the next day after she walked, she was in the car driving to Washington, D.C., because she had received a coveted fellowship from the Office of Technology Assessment, which is no longer in operation, but it was a wonderful program that gave newly minted PhDs the opportunity to work with members of Congress, with senators, to provide background information for bills that they were investigating. And I suspect that Theo looked pretty interesting by virtue of her background in science. So she worked there for 2 years, and anybody who knows how DC works, when I graduated from college, I went to DC thinking I was going to take it by storm as well. Ended up working on a Senate staff, but not in the way that she meant. When you're in DC as a young person, you go out and you go to a lot of cocktail parties and you meet lots and lots of people. It was through that channel that she met Rich Leroff, who worked for a group called the Conservation Foundation that soon merged with the World Wildlife Fund. And she went to work for them immediately after she finished with her fellowship. And it was that position that she held up until 2000 when she retired and then went on to found a nonprofit organization. So that's Theo Colburn. Now, what was the context of the environmental movement in the late 80s when she came to, have a PhD and work in environmental issues? Well, let's take you back just a little bit to the 1960s. This is my generation. When I graduated from high school and went off to college, I was so excited because I was from a small town in Oklahoma, hardly been out of Oklahoma. At university, I had the chance to go to Milwaukee for a national conference, went with a carload of kids, was so excited to go through Chicago for the first time. But unfortunately, I couldn't see Chicago when we got there. It was totally covered in smog. Something that it's hard for us to realize these days, but it was really true. And this is, taken from, the top photo is from the perspective of Detroit, but Detroit was as smoggy as Chicago was at that time. Not only that, but, decades of dumping by companies, industries, into the waterways, right, resulted in major problems. The Cuyahoga River caught fire in June of 1969, shocked the country. But just a few months later, and the Rouge River did exactly the same thing, caught fire and burned. Well, this was outraging people, and it's not by accident that in 1970, with a response to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is always in the background, you have to understand the impact that it had on the environmental movement. The Environmental Protection Agency was founded in 1970, and important for our story too, Environment Canada a year later. Now, Theo's working in the 1980s, so fast forward. What has the Environmental Protection Agency been able to do? Well, it passed bills to protect the water, to protect our air, clean it up, and so forth. But by the 80s, these point source notions of pollution, where, like with Rachel Carson, where you could just get rid of DDT by banning its production in the U.S. By the 80s, environmentalists recognized that it was not going to be so easy to manage the problems that we had because there were point source pollutions, but non-point source pollutions, things where you couldn't trace it back to the source. And there were lots of other problems, particularly these persistent chemicals of concern. And I'm going to end the presentation when I talk about another persistent chemical of concern today. And these were causing a lot of problems, particularly in the Great Lakes. But as we're going to see, it was in the 80s that they discovered that things did not stay put. They would get into the atmosphere. So all of the globe was going to be impacted. So the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement comes in to the story at this point as well. I can't go into any detail, but since 1909, with the founding of the Boundary Waters Treaty between the U.S. and Canada, we share the Great Lakes, right, with our neighbor, but by the 60s and 70s, this collaboration that we had was entering a key phase by virtue of having to tackle the pollution. I took this timeline off of a brochure that was published around in the 1990s, but I just draw your attention to the fact that in 1972, there was the first Great Lakes Water Quality Act that was passed with US and Canada signing, followed 6 years later by a second one in which they are trying to reach an agreement, because they're going to have to collaborate on how to approach tackling pollution in the Great Lakes. And so that is the backdrop to what's going on in the 1980s and to Theo Colburn's work. The other thing, I mentioned briefly this persistent chemical PCBs. Anybody ever heard of PCBs?
No.
They're in Michigan. You know, if you live up close to St. Clair River and so forth, you know PCBs, because they're still causing us many major problems. They are a persistent toxic chemical, and they stay put. So you think, okay, well, we can just clean up the dirt and remove it. But not so with PCBs. In fact, it's often better just to leave them where they are, because they travel so easily. Once you know, they'll stay put in the muck, but if you remove them, they can get into the air. So PCBs, I went off to Indiana University in 1977 to get my PhD, and when I moved to Bloomington, there were headlines about PCBs in the newspaper, and I thought, what in the world is that, right? But there was a GE chemical plant that wasn't too far from Bloomington, Indiana, and it was causing a lot of problems there, just as it did in the Hudson River in the 1980s. That was coming to the fore. So they put the PCBs to the 78 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and they called for the virtual elimination of them at the time. It was a pretty big charge that they were given. But they are persistent. Once they're there, they scarcely biodegrade. So that was one of the problems. Well, enter Theo Colburn as a newly minted associate of the Conservation Foundation. She came in and was hired to do a study of the Great Lakes fauna. So the animals, the pollution problems that might be showing up in Great Lakes animals. You know, it's interesting at the time because there was a lot of attention. I'm working on this. This is, as I said, this is part of the second chapter, and I always put myself a challenge of, you know, kind of working on it by making a presentation. And in putting this presentation together, I realized how much agitation was going on in U.S. and Canadian circles about pollution problems in the Great Lakes at the time. So she began to work on two different topics. One was a book project on the state of the Great Lakes environment, but also she was supposed to be hired to just do a study of the literature, mainly on the U.S. side. The Canadians had access to the literature that their researchers were producing, but this is before the internet, right? They needed an American worker to scour the American literature on that, and that's what she was hired to do for a 6 weeks project. It was supposed to be something very little. And this is the book, little booklet, I should say. Fortunately, I was able to get it from University of Windsor's library that she produced. It was she called it the Great Lake Toxics Working Paper. And it presents the results of her findings from going through the biology literature at the time. And they gave her a whole series of things to look for, which she did. Now, this graphic is included in that little booklet, and it shows you the areas of concern, and for ecologists, it's got a particular meaning, as they become targeted projects that people work on. And I just draw your attention to the ones, I mean, they're all around the Great Lakes, but look at the ones that are impacting Detroit, Cleveland in particular. So it's these were some of the situation that was the background for this project. She took a series of 17 keystone species, and then began to scour the literature for any report of a problem in these species. And she thoroughly expected to find cancer, because the mindset in the 80s was that if you're exposed to pollution, it will cause cancer, tumors. But when she began to tally up her findings, she found that cancer was not really present. And I'll show you in the next slide. I'll go ahead and show you. There's the tumors. She only found tumors in 2 of those 17 species. What she found were behavioral changes, generational effects, and reproductive problems that the species were having. This was a shock. No one else had ever done this kind of research. And so she began to scratch her head. That's what a scientist does, right? They identify a problem, and then they try to say, well, what's causing this problem? What have I identified here? Well, she later said, I sat in a wonderful position where I pulled all this information together, and if you've seen the way Theo Colburn works, she lays out everything on a huge desk and has, surrounded by her data. I sat looking at it and said, there's something wrong here. It began to fall out that there are serious problems and actual population declines, crashes. The youngsters didn't hatch, or if they did, they didn't look good, so birth defects. Behavioral studies began to come out. The birds weren't behaving right. Females and females were pairing. Male birds were not being territorial. Male fish had both female and male reproductive organs. These were developmental problems. Well, she began working, she had already begun working with a series of Canadian biologists, and I had the good fortune to interview Michael Gilbertson last month in Windsor. And through Michael, I was also able to meet another person that's come today, Sally Colmish, whom I met in December. And Sally knew Theo Colborn when she was working on these projects with the International Joint Commission, whose office is over in Windsor. And so after she had produced these results, then she was asked by the commissioners of the International Joint Commission, and there are 6 commissioners, 3 of whom are Canadian and 3 are from the US. And we actually have one of the current scientific advisors from the IJC in the room as well. And you all actually, you know one another already. Okay, great. So Michael began working with her, and as Sally told me, she when Theo gave her presentation to the commissioners, she said she just blew them away. And this was important because these were, all 6 of these people were conservatives, political conservatives. And yet, they tend not to be very responsive to environmental problems and thinking that, they can be solved. But she dumbfounded them, as Sally said. And her findings were actually included in the IJC 5th Biennial Report that was published in 1990. So all of a sudden, that little working booklet that she had prepared is being noticed. It was also noticed in a little publication called the Water Reporter, which is more kind of a newsletter, which I found in her archives, in which this was published in 1988, so it's directly coming out of the work that she had just done. It's interesting because this provided me information about the backdrop, namely a report that had been published by 2 employees of Environment Canada, that's like our EPA, called Toxic Chemicals in the Great Lakes Ecosystem, that sent warning signs throughout the ecological and political community. And so she is kind of building on this warning that they had already had a few years earlier. The other thing that she's building on, and this was published in that same booklet, was the discovery that these chemicals, as I say, don't stay put, that they get up into the atmosphere, and so they are spread. So, fish contaminated with toxaphene, a cotton pesticide widely used in the South until it was banned in 1983, could be discovered in a lake in Isle Royal, right? The most pristine park in the Great Lakes. And the only explanation for that was transport through the atmosphere. So all of a sudden, this wasn't just a local Great Lakes problem. It was a national and indeed an international problem. Well, she began to say it's not cancer, it's developmental problems. And then she began to say, what is it that is causing these problems? Now we are confronted with the knowledge that more subtle disease and dysfunctionality outcomes occur from living organisms, exposure to toxics, in addition to or rather than malignancies. And this was particularly problematic because with cancer, I mean, by the 70s and 80s, I mean, cancer was pretty much still a death sentence, right? We had a war on cancer that one of our presidents put together and so on. So cancer was what everybody was afraid of, but these kinds of malignancies are even more onerous because you have to live with them often. If they don't kill you outright, you are never the person, if you were exposed in utero, you're never the person that your genes had originally intended for you to be, right? You were exposed to toxins that altered your development. So she began to call for new funding to analyze this problem, and she put that into that book project that she had been working on with a series of Canadian environmentalists, which was finally published in 1990, so just a year or two after she had done that little booklet study. It's called Great Lakes, Great Legacy, and it was a much more comprehensive examination of the problem. I took out, for want of time, some of the press reports that came out of that book, but it began, her findings got national press coverage. So okay, she's no longer just a grandmother, doing work. She's a major figure in environmental research. I put a picture of Sandra and Joe Jacobson in just because we're at Wayne State, and they are too. They are with the psychology department. They're part of the medical school, and they came to Wayne State in 1984. They both gotten degrees from Harvard, basically child neuropsychology, and they began a series of papers. The first published in 1983 and the last in 1996, and it's that last paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine that was a real shock. Because as they had shown in the 80s, children who had been exposed in utero to PCBs that their mothers ate, not when they were in gestation, but even years earlier, had suffered from IQ deficits in the range of 6.2 points on average. That's huge for anybody who knows how these things. That means that whatever their genetic profile was when they were conceived, they were never going to live up to that as children. And this made a huge impact on Theo because it was the first real evidence that she had that these chemicals, because PCBs are endocrine disruptors, were impacting humans and not just wildlife. So she, after the publication of the book and the IJC report and so forth, all of a sudden, Theo Colburn is catapulted into the limelight. She does a number, she's invited to go testify before Senate committees and House committees on the environment. And she recommended to them that they include, when they are funding the various agencies, that they include money that would allow them to study the developmental effects from the risk of exposure to these kinds of toxic persistent chemicals. The other thing that she did, and this is again that picture of the young girl graduating from college, she was not timid. She decided that she was onto something, but she wanted to get evidence from other researchers. You know, she wasn't going to go it alone. She knew she couldn't. So she got together about 24 researchers, and they weren't just biologists, wildlife biologists, although there were some. They were biomedical people, some people who worked purely in laboratory biology, some who were endocrinologists, others who were working in medical laboratories. And she pulled them all together. They did not know one another before they came to this lovely conference center that she had access to by virtue of her ties with the World Wildlife Fund and its funders. In Racine, Wisconsin, it's called the Wing Spread Center, and there have been a number of really famous conferences there that result in things. This one was particularly interesting. So in September, I interviewed a woman, Anna Soto, who's at Tufts Medical School in Boston, and she was present at this first Wing Spread meeting. And it was very interesting to find out that all of these people were called together, each of them gave papers, and at the end of the conference, they sat around the table and said, what can we make of this data? And then they came up with what they called the Wing Spread Consensus Statement, which was published in 1991. Now, it was unanimous. All of the researchers there signed on to this statement, which basically said that a large number of man-made chemicals, so industrial synthetic chemicals, that have been released into the environment have the potential to disrupt the endocrine system of animals, including humans. They also came up with, Anna claims that she's the one who came up with the notion of endocrine disruption, and it may be, because it does begin to appear. They all kind of, at the end, they went off in their separate ways, but they were all dedicated to doing further research on endocrine disrupting chemicals and to getting more funding from the federal government and other sources for that. These papers were published the next year by Theo with an assistant, and this was on the cover. We are certain of the following. A large number of man-made chemicals have been released into the environment, and they have the potential to disrupt the endocrine systems of animals, including humans. So that was on the cover. I've got the book. It's just scientific paper after scientific paper. Theo published 3 articles in that particular book. Well, I want to stand back, particularly for the people who are non-biologists, and try to make sense of the impact that this had. For one thing, how do these chemicals get into the environment? Well, this particular graphic was published in a book, a popular book, that Theo published in 1996, which I won't mention in today's talk. But it's PCBs. Remember I said that PCBs settle into the muck at the bottom of rivers and lakes and so forth. Well, unfortunately, there are little zooplankton that are, feeding on the soil and the plants therein, and then they get eaten up by bigger ones. And you can see here the zooplankton, then they get eaten up by other little aquatic organisms, and eventually they get eaten by the fish. And they are then transferred and magnified at each change in the trophic level to the top predators, in this case herring gulls. So it's not by accident that you find herring gull kind of figuring into a lot of the studies that the biologists are doing, because they're sentinel species. And they are magnified, and once they, for us, if you're eating a fish caught in the Detroit River, then that PCB gets transferred to your body because it's taken up in the fat of the fish, and then it transfers to your body fat, and that's how those women who gave birth to the children, they were not eating a lot of Great Lakes fish, but they were enough to where it was transferred to their fetuses. So how do these endocrine disrupting chemicals work once they get into your body? Well, they can mimic the structure of hormones. So we all know about, estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, right? Pretty important for our sexual development. But there are lots of other hormones as well that they can mimic. And they can enter into the environment directly or indirectly through the atmosphere. Although they're generally found at low levels, the human endocrine system is sensitive to very minute quantities in the body. And the other thing that is important to notice is that it depends on the time that the body comes into contact with this, because it's the time of development that can really impact how extensive damage is going to be to the developing organism. And I just, this is a little graphic drawn from the same book just to kind of tell you about all of the various elements of the human endocrine system. Now, we've been talking kind of generally about these synthetic chemicals. What are they, and how did they get into the environment? Well, little focus on the chemical industry here. Many of you probably don't know much about the history of chemistry. I was a chem major in undergraduate, as an undergraduate, and I was fascinated by chemistry. I still am. And this, this wonderful world of chemistry is true. I mean, particularly, it's since the First World War, but mainly since the Second World War, that there's been an explosive growth in the number of chemicals on the market. And there are just a number of, 3M in Minnesota, DuPont that is focused on the East Coast and around New Jersey. Their subsidiary, Chemours. Dow, you know where Dow is?
Michigan.
Midland.
Midland, Michigan.
Yeah. So we are smack dab. I always tell my students in history of Michigan, Detroit and Michigan are models for almost every part of the history of the U.S., and it's really true. So they began, particularly after the Second World War. It's interesting, I thought, the chemical industries were dominant, but they had gotten a lot of money out of the war because they were associated with Manhattan Project, but that money was coming down. They needed some new products to give them a new bottom line, and they began to look to these new products that their chemists were turning out. And these were these persistent chemicals that were mainly made on the basis of chlorine and fluorine as their basis, okay? So PCBs, Teflon, Scotchgard. I'm going to go into detail about each of these. So Teflon. How many people have Teflon cooking ware? Okay? I did too, until I have recently said, my gosh, Marcia, you're doing this project knowing the dangers of Teflon. Get rid of it. And I've gone over to stainless steel now. But Teflon, look at it, it was discovered in 1938, so it's not a post-World War II, but it was discovered then, but it was marketed post-World War II. And it was mainly DuPont, at their Jackson laboratory, that began to come out with this. And they immediately said, hey, food won't stick to any pan that's got this coating on it, right? Because it's just nothing sticks to it. So Teflon came out. Interestingly, as somebody who works on women in science, technology, and so forth, I was really interested to learn that Scotchgard was an invention of a female chemist, and there were not too many of those in the marketplace in the early 1950s. Patsy Sherman, and accidentally, so she's working on fluorochemicals with the fluorine as the base for it. And she started, just by accident, she mixed up something, and all of a sudden, they realized that, it was water resistant, this particular product. How many people have ever used Scotchgard? I've got it in my closet. I spray it on my suede shoes in the wintertime, right? It's seemingly magic, because you can spray it on and you can go out in the snow and ice, and I've got hiking boots that are treated with it. That's not the only thing. I mention those because we have a major company here, Wolverine Worldwide. It's over close to Grand Rapids, that manufactures. They do Merrill shoes and Hush Puppies, if you ever knew about Hush. Anyway, they used it, but it's not just that. Carpet, anybody making carpet, nobody wants to spill wine on their carpet and have it go in, so they put the Scotchgard on it. Automotive upholstery cleaner, treated paper, including, I had never quite realized this, like butcher block paper, when you go to get your fish and it's in that kind of waxy-like paper that doesn't get wet when the fish are thawing out. That paper was, a lot of that paper, I say, was produced in Parchment, Michigan, very close to Kalamazoo. Waterproof fabrics and shoes, and we're also going to be talking about some other things. So, in short, chemical industry produced a lot of things that have become the backbone of modern consumer society. They are in just about everything that we are in the market. Plastics, if you ever, the famous line from The Graduate, go into plastics, young man, right? Someone graduating from college. Plastics, they've become essential, but they're, the problem is with these things that they have repercussions, environmental repercussions, and human health repercussions. The other thing that is just now coming out is that the chemical industry knew about the toxicity of these products early on. So I've got my little biologists, in the late 1980s that are doing work to say, oh, well, look at these problems we're having in the fauna around the Great Lakes. But if they'd gone and talked to 3M, they'd have found out exactly why. They already knew as early as the 50s, right, when they first began to produce the chemicals that they were toxic and that they caused cancer. And they are not biodegradable, right? They don't, once they're persistent, they stay put. They also began denying, because 2 U.S. scientists found that there were these PCBs, the Scotchgard was turning up in human blood samples. Why are they in the blood banks, right? We don't know, not our chemicals. They literally said that. And in 1999, an environmental scientist who was working for 3M, who had been, kind of tracking these things, finally resigned, and he wrote a really long and detailed letter, which I read recently. And he said that the company misleadingly downplayed to regulators. That's the human, to the EPA as well as the NIH, right? Any regulator, that these chemicals were transferred through the food chain. So they lied. They denied and they lied. And this book by a colleague of mine who's at Harvard, Naomi Oreskes, and her colleague, Eric Conway, If you're interested, they've actually, it's been a blockbuster book, and there's a DVD out on the same topic. Maybe some of you saw, but right before Christmas, a movie that's just come out called The Dark Waters. It's starring Mark Ruffalo, who helped to produce the film. It's the only place it's playing now is way up, about 25 miles from where I live, up in the northern suburbs. So I haven't been able to see it because it first came out during finals week, right? But it'll be out on the market and available on Netflix in February. So the story here is that he investigated a family in West Virginia that was impacted by water that was given off by the DuPont factory that made Teflon. And it was the same thing, deny, lie, and so forth. And that's the whole theory. He happened to be a corporate lawyer whose grandma lived in this little town, and these were their neighbors. So anyway, I can't wait to see the film. It's getting pretty good press. So, in conclusion, I just want to say, things have changed a lot, and I've just worked on a slice that I provided you, basically from the 80s and the 1990s. That when Rachel Carson, warned about problems with DDT, what did the EPA do? Well, 2 years after it's found they banned it, right? At least the production was banned here. We could ship it abroad, so it was still available. But they could do that. And then in the 80s, the EPA could do a similar ban on PCBs, which they did. But what about these chemicals that are in endocrine disruptors? There are hundreds of them, and more turn up all the time. And I just will remind you, water bottles, do you remember we buy water bottles that say no BPA in our water bottles? And when I went to talk to Anna Soto in September, I said, but Anna, at least we've gotten rid of BPA. And she just looked at me and said, they're just producing a substitute, and it's probably just the same, So, and I was, my babies had pacifiers. Both of my babies used pacifiers. And the softener that they used in the nipples for baby bottles carried these chemicals. So they're everywhere. So we're facing a regulatory dilemma, right? They're essential to our culture. I mean, I haven't stopped giving up my plastics and so forth. They are also highly lucrative to the chemical companies. So in 2000, a year after the resignation of that environmentalist, finally 3M agreed with EPA that they would take Scotchgard off of the market. I mean, we're 2020, that's 10 years ago, right? And they had it on the market for 50 years. And each year, it turned out, they were making $500 million from that chemical. I have no idea how much DuPont made from Teflon. Probably, you can see why these companies, it depends on the ethics, I guess, around the board. But there's a problem here, particularly because, as we know now from what's happening with EPA, it's very easy for a particular administration to come in. We already knew that in the 80s, and try to weaken the ability of EPA to regulate, and that's exactly what is happening currently. So all we can do is to keep up pressure. So Michigan or Minnesota began to sue 3M for all of the water problems that they had had in their state in 2010. They just settled it in 2018. And in September, the former Attorney General gave testimony before Congress on this issue, and that's where I'm taking a lot of this information from what came out in the discovery of their lawsuit. Michigan just filed its own lawsuit last week. Now, the Michigan lawsuit, you may or may not know, is because of problems that we're having with PFAS. How many people have heard about PFAS? Boy, that's a lot better than last year when I gave a presentation on this. Very few people knew about PFAS. Now at least it's coming to the fore. Because the PFAS are over in that, over by Grand Rapids. Rockford's really heavily damaged. In Parchment, where that paper company was, they had to shut down their water system, and now they're transporting water from Kalamazoo to Parchment. But those people have been exposed to these chemicals. They are human guinea pigs. So we will see about their health impacts. Firefighting foam, every fire station in the state and really the country has been using these firefighting foams. And if you know anything about Wurtsmith Air Base near Oscoda, I mean, people who are living in Oscoda, their wells have been contaminated. So it's not that, how are you going to bring water from a nearby community out to a rural state? So PFAS are, 99% of Americans have PFAS in their blood today. We all have it. But one of the things that I'm hoping to do with this book is to tell people that PFAS are endocrine disruptors. I think people have kind of kept it under wraps because it would be too frightening to people to find out. But people should know, right? You should be able to take precautions. So Theo, as I said, died in 2014, and her entire life, literally up until the day she died, had been devoted to these environmental problems. And she explains, I think it's very interesting, when that's all the benzene ring as the origin of life and how we are somehow attacking it, right? We interfere with that chemistry at our peril because humans and all organisms have evolved. Our life evolves on this. So by interfering with these hormones that define human health, we're changing humanity. So the title of her 1996 book was Our Stolen Future, and that's the implication there. And she says, I want people protected. So I do too. And that's kind of what's animating me going forward with this book project. So I hope I didn't go over too long. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes.
I was curious about, you said the plastics are not non-biodegradable, and then you showed different types of products that have plastic, and one of them was the medicine capsules.
Yeah.
Are the capsules that, I don't know how far back that picture is, but I mean, are the medical capsules that people receive now, are they the same material or different?
I think that's probably misleading, that graphic, because if we take a capsule, it's got to biodegrade in our stomachs when it's attacked by acid, right? So that we're getting it's giving us the dose that we require and so forth. But
I'm talking about the plastic itself, not the medicine.
Yeah, the plastic and they don't biodegrade, but they are reusable. We can. I'm a religious recycler, so I recycle just about all of the numbers of plastics, right? So that we're not having to create a lot more plastic. That once in the environment we can at least reduce. But it's not plastic per se. It's the chemicals that are used in the plastics and that can leach out. So this one said no BPA was used in the making of this plastic, and then my little, this as well. But again, we have to make sure, one of the problems, and there is a whole chapter in the book that's going to be talking about regulation, about which I knew very little and I'm still learning. But one of the things is that we are still using very old notions about regulating chemicals. The chemicals that 3M and DuPont put into the, and Dow put into the environment, they don't have to say ahead of time that they are not harmful. So it's only, you know, we're all guinea pigs of sorts. It's decades later when we discover that they're harmful. So a lot of regulators, including Theo Colburn, wanted them to be regulated, you know, that they have to do, when they come up with a new chemical, it has to be tested before it gets put onto the market. Hi.
Hi. So back in the period that you were talking about in the early 1980s, besides PCBs, there was another chemical, PBB,
Yeah.
a brominated one, which is not as widespread, I guess,
But we in Michigan know about PBBs.
But the way it was covered in the news,
Yeah.
and it very much showed how these chemicals can spread widely, because what happened, and I'm saying this for the audience, some of the audience that may not know this, what happened is it was a bag of feed for cows, a bag of fire retardant, PBBs, was substituted, and the cows ate the PBB. It got into their milk. The farmers, of course, that were dealing with those cows, they got very high levels of PBBs, but it spread throughout all of Michigan and surrounding states, presumably through the milk. So it didn't disrupt the reproduction of my family, but the Jacobsons were also involved with that as well. And I don't know whether your book or your research also covers the PBBs as well, but it showed how it could spread. You know, from a couple of farms, it's in everybody's body.
Yeah, and I include that incident in both my history of Michigan and my environmental history class, because it was in the mid-70s, and it was it's been called the poisoning of Michigan. But they kept it under wraps. And in fact, even today, there's not been a historian, a proper historian who's looked at that, because it's hard to get access to the data. Even the state has kind of, it's kind of hard to believe that Milligan was the governor, because he's widely touted as the environmentalist, right? But it was under his watch that this happened. But PBBs are mentioned in the 70s, but probably I will only go, and because most of the papers that Jacobsons are publishing, they're looking at PCBs. Yeah.
As you were speaking, I always thought about it, wasn't the talk, it's so insightful to me. I'm taking a climate change class, and it's just perfect. I have a question. Okay, now, with PCBs and PFAS, and at that to the 70s, we were dealing with DDTs, and the list of chemicals goes on, and I keep thinking, isn't this like an environmental soup that we're all swimming in, and all these chemicals are getting, what about the mix of all these chemicals? I mean, what is that doing? Like, individual chemicals are bad enough, but what about the chemical soup we're swimming in?
Yeah, and that's exactly what Theo Colburn and a lot of other people said. Well, if you're looking at just one chemical, then that's not accurate, because an individual is exposed to a whole variety of chemicals, and it's very difficult to trace which particular one might have caused thyroid problems, or obesity, or it is a chemical soup. So they advocated the precautionary principle, that even if we don't know, if there's any hint that there might be some problems, just don't put it on the market, because 50 years later, we're going to be living with it. And the people who got rich off of this, they're gone, right? But it's their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and ours that are going to be impacted. So it's one of the things I'm encountering is how to approach that, because you want to be fair to the chemical companies, but on the other hand, for the bad actors, I think you need to to actually say you committed fraud, and fraud that is harming humanity as a result. So you've got to be accurate, But I was really happy to find, and I literally, it was once the Michigan filed their lawsuit against 3M, in the free press notice, they said a researcher, had published this letter in 1999, so I could Google that. And in Googling that, then I got to the suit that Minnesota had already filed and just settled, and that her testimony was from September, so just a few months ago. So historians are, they're detectives too, and it's hard. It's hard to kind of piece things together, but you've got to be accurate. But when you've got lawsuits that you can rely on, I've got data now, right? Accurate data. Somebody else had a question? Yes.
Okay, I was just wondering, do you have more information on the lawsuit that Michigan has filed? Like, are they doing, have they already done studies on the health impacts of the people living there?
You know that it was under the Snyder administration was considering doing a lawsuit, and they actually, in the lame duck session, there was the legislature was considering what to do. But our legislature is still controlled by Republicans, and there was some weakening of what actually was passed. And like we had, I think in Michigan is a very interesting case because of the PFAS crisis. Michigan, we are in the lead, taking one of the leads nationally in the PFAS crisis, precisely because of Flint, right? Because the Snyder administration realized they made serious problems with poisoning people in Flint with the water, trying to cut corners on the Flint municipal budget. And because of that, they didn't exactly get out, were out in front. Originally, they were told about PFAS in 2012, and they kept it under wraps. But as the Flint crisis developed, they said, okay, we're going to put money into this. And they set up, if you go to the state of Michigan, it's got a pretty robust website on PFAS, so if you want to go and find out more about it, they do have it. But in terms of regulating and trying to get our water supply to have minimum amounts of PFAS in them, we haven't gotten there yet. They're following EPA standards, and EPA standards have been weakened by the Trump administration, so we're still in it, right? It's this little game that we play, regulatory game. So, yeah, PFAS is going to be a big issue, and the only thing that I think is, with that lawsuit, I presume that they're going to use a lot of the things that came out in the Minnesota trial. For example, Wolverine Worldwide, they're a major company, and a Michigan company that did really well. If you know Hush Puppies, they came out, and I think I had them when I was a kid, they were first marketed. You probably had Hush Puppies, and they went from there, and they've got all kinds of hiking gear, my hiking boots.
Big.
They're still big. I got a pair of boots for Christmas from them. But they were told by 3M that they didn't need to worry about that. They had a holding pond for the refuse that was coming off of when they would, treat the shoes and, the other things. And it's that holding pond that leaked into the Rockford water system, and it's basically, poisoned that whole area right outside of Grand Rapids. So Rockford is, Wolverine is probably going to be involved. They'll have to, 3M is going to have to settle with Wolverine and the state of Michigan. But the firefighting foam and the thing in parchment, which is what companies do is they declare bankruptcy. It's like the company that with the green ooze out at 696. That is, I wish I were teaching environmental history this semester, because that is amazing. That guy, he just dug a pit, 4 foot, a 4-foot pit in the middle of his factory and dumped stuff in it for years, right? And that green ooze has gotten into the groundwater system. So, I mean, we've got a long ways to go, and we cannot rely on the government, totally on the government. But the lawsuit will be of interest. But it, you know, I don't know anything about it. They just filed it, and that's, I guess Nassau had decided that she had enough material to go on to file it now.
Spread the word about this very important topic.
I wanted to know, is it possible?